In chapter 1115 and 1116 of One Piece, Vegapunk provides the world with plenty of revelations. From the dramatic rising sea levels to the ancient weapons still existing, but there are two particular comments that sparked a particular train of thought in us. One being the overarching revelation that the One Piece world has been covered in seawater during the Void Century.
And the other being Vegapunk's adamant repetition that he is not spreading this message to cast judgment. So let's start by looking at the first of these 2 points with what we learned in chapter 1115.
We start by learning that the One Piece world is currently at risk of once again sinking as it had done in the Void Century, and in Doflamingo's own words, it would only take about 5 more Lelousias, we'll call it, for most of the world to be unlivable.
And this sinking can be directly linked to the usage of the ancient weapons, as Vegapunk claims they are currently a risk once more due to his creation and part in recreating the Mother Flame.
Especially now that York has stolen that fragment, it only takes that small amount of power to destroy an island, and the ancient weapons usage was more than likely the same reason for the same disaster occurring before in history, as Vegapunk mentions as well, that during the Void Century, in just 100 years, the sea levels rose 200 meters without any predictions of such a thing happening.
However, as Vegapunk himself makes sure to cite frequently, he only has a limited amount of information. He only has pieces. He doesn't know the full scope of this story. He knows there was a war, and that the Ancient Kingdom created these ancient weapons, and that those weapons were used to cause the ultimate flooding that sank most of the world. But he never states who used them or who is truly at fault.
And the fact that that omission exists, and the fact that Vegapunk is repeatedly encouraging all listeners to not be so quick to judge those involved on either side, leads us to believe that this great conflict of the Void Century was much more of a morally ambiguous conflict between two sides of gray, which is much more consistent with what we've seen in the actual story between the sides of pirates and the sides of marines, where there's good and bad and mixed on both sides.
Exactly. So while Joyboy was the primary opponent of the 20 Kingdoms, including Emu, it's very important to keep in mind that he made the decision to depart from his homeland of the Ancient Kingdom. So it's not as though his personal philosophy necessarily aligned with that Ancient Kingdom in the first place.
Plus, Vegapunk himself stated that the Void Century ended once Joyboy was defeated. However, throughout this time he describes that the sea level was rising and rising, and if it only takes about 5 more meters for the current world to disappear, you can imagine that the sea level was rising as these ancient weapons were used. That ancient kingdom would have been on the seafloor before the conflict had ever ended between Joyboy and the 20 Kings. Which means the conflict in the end was solely Joyboy versus the 20 Kingdoms for some time. If that were already the case and the kingdom was already destroyed, why would the government suddenly be able to gain the upper hand in that final stand? These are just some of the questions about this conflict that seem to make the picture a bit more distorted than what we've been led to believe so far. So, let's try and clear that up by taking a look at a few details regarding the start of the Void Century, the Great War itself, and Joyboy's defeat that concluded the century, to try and determine what it is that really happened.
And so, starting off at the beginning of the Void Century, it's really interesting that we really don't know of a single inciting incident still at this point that could have led to this ultimate conflict between the great nation of the Ancient Kingdom and this 20 Kingdom coalition.
And that leaves the door open for discussion. Was the Ancient Kingdom themselves the ones who even maybe instigated this conflict by attacking these weaker and less advanced nations? And it is suspected that the coalition of 20 kingdoms was formed perhaps in an effort to oppose the Ancient Kingdom. And from this great tech and from Joyboy, they have all of the assets on their side. It's possible every other nation felt threatened.
And it's also possible that Joyboy himself wasn't even initially involved in the origin of this great war. He joined somewhere in the middle.
However, once the war itself began, we do have a bit more information. So shifting our focus to the Great War itself, We do know that across the 100 years of the Void Century, there was a number of conflicts. While I'm sure there were plenty of annihilations similar to Lelucia, there were also situations like Shandora that we learn about from the Poneglyph of a great kingdom that collapsed during this era for standing likely with the Ancient Kingdom.
And so it seems to make sense that at some point, Joyboy knew that he was going to be on the losing side of this war and prepared the Poneglyphs to apologize to Poseidon of that time. And across this time, the Kozuki family was also recording the events of the ongoing world on their own Poneglyphs.
And while more of a side note, something that does come back into the story eventually, this was the same time that the Lunarians were hunted down all throughout the One Piece world as they were trying to ensure anybody that had inhabited the Red Line previously was exterminated from the picture. So Vegapunk does make the point that these weapons of this time were far beyond his comprehension, and he could be alluding to the ancient weapons himself, but it's possible this conflict itself just included weapons that were just beyond his own knowledge on both sides.
Exactly, and with all of the things we just listed, it's hard to believe that only one side would be involved in some of the negative and very violent actions that are going on. Again, calling back to that gray area that very likely existed, where there may have been some evil on both sides.
And regardless of who it was that incited it, or who it was that propagated this war to last for so long, we do know it eventually came to an end, as Vegapunk had said, with Joyboy's defeat. And once this defeat had occurred, the kingdom had been buried at that point, and it seemed as though they knew this was going to be coming. And that's like why we said during the time of the Great War, he already had that poneglyph created to apologize to Poseidon, so when the loss came, they could have that delivered to them.
But once Joyboy was out of the picture officially, the Council of Kings established themselves as the world government that is known today, with each ruler abdicating the empty throne, with the exception of Lily.
And her defiance of Imu at the conclusion of this war holds a lot of interesting information as well, because not only did Lily attempt to leave the entire situation of Marie Joie after they had cleared the Lunarians out of their home, but she chose to not live atop their conquered enemies and also dispel the poneglyphs in the process. Which means that by the conclusion of this war, the 20 kingdoms would have not only cleared out this land for their new headquarters, but have also somehow gathered the poneglyphs in the process, which is honestly a completely understated feat for them to have during this Void Century.
Very much so. And if this was the case, that would mean that the Coalition had been so dominant that they not only took possession of the poneglyphs, sank the other kingdom, they also expelled the Lunarians from their new headquarters. That just sounds like an incredibly one-sided war when you actually weigh all the different results that would have came from this one thing.
And yet the time period for this conflict is extensive, spanning an entire century, and the pillages of war were definitely not just one-sided, as it seems like a lot of the One Piece world faced the effects of it. So how is it possible that the side that had less tech, no Joyboy, and no ancient weapons to begin with, managed to get everything they had wanted as the underdog?
So, as a quick recap, we know that by the end of the war, the Ancient Kingdom was laid to ruin by the ancient weapons. So at some point, they had to shift hands. And just how that occurred appears to be the point where the battlefield was equalized. So the real question here is, how did they manage to steal the Ancient Kingdom's greatest assets and power, aside of course from Joyboy?
Well, since the Ancient Kingdoms was the one who created these weapons in the first place, it's likely to think that one of those who would understand how to operate it better would be the one, rather than the 20 kings themselves, who would present this or somehow manage to smuggle these weapons to the Coalition. But what if it wasn't just an ordinary betrayer? What if the one who provided these weapons to the 20 kings was Joyboy himself?
And it might sound outlandish at first that it would be for him to turn against his homeland and support the group that he allegedly would fight until the conclusion of the Void Century. But it actually makes more sense when you really dig into it.
We've already talked about the fact that the Ancient Kingdom was so powerful and advanced that it took 20 of the world's richest kingdoms pooling their resources in order to stand a chance. And these were no pushovers in terms of military might. You have to look that the Don Quixote family was already using slave labor to build their riches and build their own collections of just resources at their disposal. So these were not just some of your weaker and more poor kingdoms. This was 20 of the top kingdoms that it took to even stand a chance.
And when you combine this with the fact that when we first learned of Joyboy from Vegapunk, we learned that he departed from the Ancient Kingdom, most likely due to a difference in philosophy, to become the first pirate of the world. So that leads us to hypothesize that he placed great importance on freedom, similar to Luffy and Roger. So this really isn't an unreasonable claim that he would actually disagree with the Ancient Kingdom's philosophy.
And perhaps the reason that Joyboy departed is because of that difference in views on an essence of freedom within the Ancient Kingdom. So, with that in mind, if Joyboy is aware that this Ancient Kingdom is as highly advanced as they are, with island-destroying weapons at their disposal, and little regard for personal interpretations of freedom for its inhabitants like himself, then suddenly the 20 Kings might seem like a much more moral cause to get behind from his point of view.
Especially when you consider, again, that they were only supposed to be a temporary coalition. This wasn't supposed to continue on the 800 years into the future that it did.
And if Joyboy were to see this group as that temporary coalition fighting for their own sense of freedom against an impressive kingdom who emphasizes advancement over personal liberty, I think Joyboy would see that as a sign to support these people with very similar ideals and personal philosophies of freedom as him. And perhaps that is why Joyboy saw stealing the Ancient Kingdom's greatest weapons as more of creating a fair fight between the two sides.
Which can further be supported by the claim that we got in 1116, that he was actually hoping to pass these ancient weapons on to the future generations, and he may have hoped that the New World government would actually use them properly to maintain order.
Perhaps the greater purpose of the ancient weapons isn't actually to be weapons at all. Perhaps they're meant to make the world some sort of better place, but all they've been used for so far is their destructive purposes and abilities. And with the ancient weapons now in the hands of the soon-to-be world government, all it would take is somebody like Emu or one of those power-hungry kings like the Don Quixotes using it just once or perhaps all of the ancient weapons a couple of times before the advanced opposition was essentially turned into Waterworld, completely buried under the sea, and didn't even stand a chance anymore.
And then realizing this error in his ways, Joyboy would most definitely oppose that this group, for the remainder of the Void Century, is going to be the one leading the world, as he realizes that they aren't actually the bastion of freedom that he thought they were.
You're right. Once he realized this, he would spend the remainder of the time assuring that they don't abuse these powers, similar to how they had just demonstrated to him. But then that leaves you with another question. Why was he seemingly prepared to finally admit defeat when the Void Century did conclude? And I believe that is because he had finally ensured that the ancient weapons were no longer usable by the 20 Kings by the time he was gone.
Especially with the Ancient Kingdom destroyed, Joyboy could remove the power source of Uranus, which was later recreated as the Mother Flame. He could return Pluton to Wano and erect the walls around the island, very possibly with his Nika powers, as we've seen Luffy do very similar things against Kaido. And then Poseidon likely pulled her support once Joyboy told her to. Perhaps his apology poneglyph came from asking her to support the group that eventually took over, thinking it would be in the effort of freedom for everyone.
So, with all of these weapons subsided, the poneglyphs written, and perhaps a knowing that Lily would dispel them, and those around the world that he had trusted to inherit his will, eventually becoming the will of D, that with all of these in place, Joyboy finally felt as though he could die in a way that would ensure his fruit would not be inherited by the world government.
And so even after being defeated, Joyboy being able to resign without really being put to rest, being able to kind of keep power out of the hands of Emu and the Gorosei would definitely create a sense of resentment, as though they had thought they'd won, but still they're moving to escape his ghost and remnants that he left against them. And it kind of explains why Vegapunk says the war is still ongoing. It never ended, even after all this time.
And that war does still exist between those embodying his will with the will of D. And despite Imu saying there's less and less and they don't understand what the will means, they're still fighting that fight. And this could explain why Imu still has the straw hat and the freezer at Marie-Joie. He's resentful of the person that he felt he had played to get the weapons initially.
And in 1116, the picture of Lily on the wall.
She played him, and maybe he thought he was inscribing all this information of how he was taking over the world in the poneglyphs, and now those are the biggest thorn in his side. He feels as though he has prevented him from having total control of what he craved. But that is just our theory for now. You guys let us know in the comments what you think about this idea. Like the video if you enjoyed. Subscribe so you can join our growing pirate family. And as always, don't forget,
Be crew.